Warwick threw himself into a chair beside me, hitched up his trousers, and leaning across, tapped me on the knee. "You remember the story about Mendingham which you told me?" he asked. I nodded. I was not likely to forget that affair. "Well," he went on, "I've got as good a one to tell you. Had it straight from the filly's mouth, so to speak, and it's red hot." I edged away in my chair, for there was something positively ghoulish in his delight, in the coarse way which he referred to a woman, and one who, if my inference were correct, must have known tragedy. But there is no stopping Warwick. He knows or admits no finer feelings or shame when his thirst for copy is aroused. Like the little boy in the well-known picture, he won't be happy till he's quenched it. I ordered drinks, and when they had been served and we were alone, bade him get on with his sordid story. "It's a wild tale," he began, "of two planter fellows in the interior of Borneo. And as usual, there's a woman." "The woman?" I could not refrain from asking, thinking of his earlier remark. "The same," he replied. "A veritable golden-haired filly. Only her mane is streaked with gray, and there's a great livid scar or wheal right round her neck. She's the wife of Leopold Thring. The other end of the triangle is Clifford Macy." "And where do you come in?" I inquired. Warwick closed one eye and pursed his lips. "As a spinner of yarns," he answered sententiously. Then, with a return to his usual cynicism, "The filly is down and out, but for some silly religious scruples feels she must live. I bought the story, therefore, after verifying the facts. Shall I go on?" I nodded, for I must admit I was genuinely interested. The eternal triangle always intrigues. Set in the wilds of Borneo, it promised a variation of incident unusually refreshing in these sophisticated days. Besides, that scar was eloquent. Warwick chuckled. "The two men were partners," he went on a small experimental estate far up in the interior. They had been at it for 6 years, and were just about to reap the fruits of their labors very handsomely. Incidentally, Macy had been out in the colony the full 6 years, and the strain was beginning to tell. Thring had been home 18 months before, and on coming back had brought his bride, Rona. That was the beginning of the trouble. It split up the partnership, brought in a new element, meant the building of a new bungalow. For Macy, I asked. Yes, and he didn't take kindly to it. He had got set. And then there was the loneliness of night after night alone, while the others— You understand? I nodded. Well, Warwick continued, the expected happened. Macy flirted, philandered, and then fell violently in love. He was one of those fellows who never do things by halves. If he drank, he'd get fighting drunk. If he loved, he went all out on it. If he hated, well, hell was let loose. And Mrs. Thring, I queried, for it seemed to me that she might have a point of view. Fell between two stools, as so many women of a certain type do. She began by being just friendly and kind, you know the sort of thing, cheering the lonely man up, drifted into woman's eternal game of flirting, and then began to grow a little afraid of the fire she'd kindled. Too late she realized that she couldn't put the fire out, either hers or Macy's, and all the while she clung to some hereditary religious scruples. Thring was in many ways easygoing, but at the same time possessed of a curiously intense strain of jealous possessiveness. He was generous, too. If asked, he would share or give away his last shirt or crust. But let him think or feel that his rights or dues were being curtailed or taken, and, well, he was a tough customer of rather primitive ideas. Rona, that's the easiest way to think of the filly, soon found she was playing a game beyond her powers. Hers was no poker face, and Thring began to sense that something was wrong. She couldn't dissemble, and Macy made no attempt to hide his feelings. He didn't make it easy for her, and I guess from what the girl told me, life about this time was for her a sort of glorified hell. A suspicious husband on one hand, and an impetuous devil-may-care lover on the other. She was living on a volcano, which might explode any minute, I quietly said. Warwick nodded. Exactly. or whenever Thring chose to spring the mine, he held the key to the situation, or should I say, the time fuse? The old story, but set in a primitive land full of possibilities. You've got me? For answer, I offered Warwick a cigarette, and taking one myself, lighted both. So far, I said, with all your journalistic skill, you've not got off the beaten track. Can't you improve? He chuckled, blew a cloud of smoke, and once again tapped my knee in his irritating manner. Your cynicism, he countered, is but a poor cloak for your curiosity. In reality, you're jumping mad to know the end, eh? I made no reply, and he went on. Well, matters went on from day to day, till Rona became worn to the proverbial shadow. Thring wanted to send her home, but she wouldn't go. She owed a duty to her husband. She couldn't bear to be parted from her lover, and she didn't dare leave the two men alone. She was terribly, horribly afraid. Macy grew more and more openly amorous and less restrained. Thring watched whenever possible with the cunning of an iguana. Then came a rainy, damp spell that tried nerves to the uttermost, and the inevitable, stupid little disagreements between Rona and Thring, mere trifles, but enough to let the lid off. He challenged her. And she? I could not help asking, for Warwick has, I must admit, the knack of keeping one on edge. Like a blithering but sublime little idiot, admitted that it was all true. For nearly a minute I was speechless. Somehow, although underneath I had expected Rona to behave so, it seemed such a senseless, unbelievable thing to do. Then at last I found my voice. "And Thring?" I said simply. Warwick emptied his glass at a gulp. "That's the most curious thing in the whole yarn," he answered slowly. Thring took it as quietly as a lamb. "Stunned?" I suggested. That's what Rona thought, what Macy believed when Rona told him what had happened. In reality, he must have been burning mad, a mass of white-hot revenge controlled by a devilish cunning brain. He waited. A scene or a fight, and Macy was a big man, would have done no good. He would get his own back in his own time and in his own way. Meanwhile, there was the lull before the storm. Then, as so often happens, fate played a hand. Macy went sick with malaria, really ill, and even Thring had to admit the necessity for Rona to nurse him practically night and day. Macy owed his eventual recovery to her care, but even so his convalescence was a long job. In the end, Rona too crocked up through overwork, and Thring had them both on his hands. This was an opportunity better than he could have planned. It separated the lovers and gave him complete control. Obviously the time was ripe for Thring to score his revenge. The rains were over, the jungle had ceased wintering, and spring was in the air. The young grass and vegetation were shooting into new life. Concurrently, all the creepy, crawly insect life of the jungle and estate was young and vigorous and hungry too. These facts gave Thring the germ of an idea which he was not slow to perfect, an idea as devilish as man could devise. Warwick paused to press out the stub of his cigarette, and noticing that even he seemed affected by his recital, I prepared myself as best I could for a really gruesome horror. All I said, however, was, "Go on." "It seems," he continued, "that in Borneo there is a kind of mammoth earwig, a thing almost as fine and gossamer as a spider's web, as long as a good-sized caterpillar, that lives on waxy secretions. These are integral parts of some flowers and trees, and lie buried deep in their recesses. It is one of the terrors of these particular tropics, for it moves and rests so lightly on a human being that one is practically unconscious of it, while, like its English relation, it has a decided liking for the human ear. On account of man's carnivorous diet, the wax in this has a strong and very succulent taste." As Warwick gave me those details, he sat upright on the edge of his easy chair. He spoke slowly, emphasizing each point by hitting the palm of his left hand with the clenched fist of his right. It was impossible not to see the drift and inference of his remarks. "You mean," I began. Exactly, he broke in quickly, blowing a cloud of smoke from a fresh cigarette which he had nervously lighted. Exactly. It was a devilish idea. To put the giant earwig on Macy's hair just above the ear. And then? I knew the fatuousness of the question, but speech relieved the growing sense of ticklish horror that was creeping over me. Do nothing, but rely on the filthy insect running true to type. Once inside Macy's ear, it was 1,000 to 1 chance against it ever coming out the same way. It would not be able to turn. To back out would be almost an impossibility, and so, feeding as it went, it would crawl right across inside his head, with the result that the picture Warwick was drawing was more than I could bear. Even my imagination, dulled by years of legal dry-as-dust affairs, saw and sickened at the possibilities. I put out a hand and gripped Warwick's arm. "Stop, man," I cried hoarsely. "For God's sake, don't say any more. I understand. My God, but the man Thring must be a fiend." Warwick looked at me, and I saw that even his face had paled. "Was," he said meaningly. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps he was a fiend. Yet remember, Macy stole his wife." "But a torture like that, the deliberate creation of a living torment that would grow into madness. Warwick, you can't condone that." He looked at me for a moment and then slowly spread out his hands. "Perhaps you're right," he admitted. "It was a bit thick, I know. But there's more to come." I closed my eyes and wondered if I could think of an excuse for leaving Warwick, but in spite of my real horror, my curiosity won the day. "Get on with it," I muttered, and leant back, eyes still shut, hands clenched, with teeth gritted together as if I myself were actually suffering the pain of that earwig slowly, daily creeping farther into and eating my brain. I waited. Warwick was not slow to obey. "I have told you," he said, "that Rona had to nurse Macy, and even when he was better, though still weak, Thring insisted on her looking after him, though now he himself came more often. One afternoon Rona was in Macy's bungalow alone with him. The houseboy was out. Rona was on the veranda. Macy was asleep in the bedroom. Dusk was just falling. Bats were flying about. The flying foxes, heavy with fruit, were returning home. The inevitable house rats were scurrying about the floors. The lamps had not been lit. An eerie, devastating hour. Rona dropped some needlework and fought back tears. Then from the bedroom came a shriek. "My head! My ear! Oh, God! My ear! Oh, God! The pain!" That was the beginning. The earwig had got well inside. Rona rushed in and did all she could. Of course there was nothing to see. Then for a little while Macy would be quiet because the earwig was quiet, sleeping or gorged. Then the vile thing would move or feed again, and Macy once more would shriek with pain. And so it went on, day by day. Alternate quiet and alternate pain each day for Macy. For Rona, a hell of nerve-rending expectancy. Waiting, always waiting for the pain that crept and crawled and twisted and writhed and moved slowly, ever slowly, through and across Macy's brain. Warwick paused so long that I was compelled to open my eyes. His face was ghastly. Fortunately, I could not see my own. "And Thring?" I asked. "Came often each day. Pretended sorrow and served out spurious dope. Rona found the colored water afterwards. He cleverly urged that Macy should be carried down to the coast for medical treatment, knowing full well that he was too ill and worn to bear the smallest strain. Then, when Macy was an utter wreck, broken completely in mind and body, with hollow, hunted eyes, with ever-twitching fingers, with a body no part of which he could properly control or keep still, the earwig came out at the other ear. As it happened, both Thring and Rona were present. Macy must have suffered an excruciating pain, followed as usual by a period of quiescence. Then, feeling a slight ticklish sensation on his cheek, put up his hand to rub or scratch. His fingers came in contact with the earwig and its fine gossamer hairs. Instinct did the rest. You follow? My tongue was still too dry to enable me to speak. Instead, I nodded, and Warwick went on. He naturally was curious and looked to see what he was holding. In an instant he realized. Even Rona could not be in doubt. The hairs were faintly but unmistakably covered here and there with blood, with wax, and with gray matter. For a moment there was absolute silence between the three. At last Macy spoke. "My God," he just whispered. "Oh, my God, what an escape!" Rona burst into tears. Only Thring kept silent, and that was his mistake. The silence worried Macy, weak though he was. He looked from Rona to Thring, and at the critical moment Thring could not meet his gaze. The truth was out. With an oath Macy threw the insect, now dead from the pressure of his fingers, straight into Thring's face. Then he crumpled up in his chair and sobbed till even the chair shook. Again Warwick paused till I thought he would never go on. I had heard enough, I'll admit, and yet it seemed to me that at least there should be an epilogue. "Is that all?" I tentatively asked. Warwick shook his head. "Nearly, but not quite," he said. Rona had ceased weeping and kept her eyes fixed on Thring. She dared not go and comfort Macy now. She saw him examine the dead earwig, having picked it up from the floor to which it had fallen, turn it this way and that, then produce from a pocket a magnifying glass which he used daily for the inspection and detection of leaf disease on certain of the plants. As she watched, she saw the fear and disappointment leave his face, to be replaced by a look of cunning and evil satisfaction. Then for the first time he spoke. "Macy!" he called in a sharp, loud voice. Macy looked up. Thring held up the earwig. "This is dead now," he said. "Dead. As dead as my friendship for you, you swine of a thief. As dead as my love for that whore who was my wife. It's dead, I tell you, dead. But it's a female. Do you get me? A female, and a female lays eggs, and before it died it—" He never finished. His baiting at last roused Macy, endowing him with the strength of madness and despair. With one spring he was at Thring's throat, bearing him down to the ground. Over and over they rolled on the floor, struggling for possession of the great hunting knife stuck in Thring's belt. One moment Macy was on top, the next Thring. Their breath and oaths came in great trembling gasps. They kicked and bit and scratched, and all the while Rona watched, fascinated and terrified. Then Thring got definitely on top. He had one hand on Macy's throat, both knees on his chest, and with his free hand he was feeling for the knife. In that instant Rona's religious scruples went by the board. She realized she only loved Macy, that her husband didn't count. She rushed to Macy's help. Thring saw her coming and let drive a blow at her head which almost stunned her. She fell on top of him just as he was whipping out the knife. Its edge caught her neck. The sudden spurt of blood shot into Thring's eyes and blinded him. It was Macy's last chance. He knew it, and he took it. When Rona came back to consciousness, Thring was dead. Macy was standing beside the body, which was gradually swelling to huge proportions as he worked, weakly but steadily, at the white ant-exterminator pump, the nozzle of which was pushed down the dead man's throat. Warwick ceased. This last had been a long, unbroken recital, and mechanically he picked up his empty glass as if to drain it. The action brought me back to nearly normal. I rang for the waiter, the knob of the electric bell luckily being just over my head. While waiting, I had time to speak. "I've heard enough," I said hurriedly, "to last me a lifetime. You've made me feel positively sick. But there's just one point. What happened to Macy? Did he live?" Warwick nodded. "That's another strange fact. He still lives. He was tried for the murder of Thring, but there was no real evidence. On the other hand, his story was too tall to be believed, with the result, well, you can guess." "A lunatic asylum for life?" I asked. Warwick nodded again. Then I followed his glance. A waiter was standing by my chair. "2 double whiskey and sodas," I ordered tersely, and then, with shaking fingers, lighted a cigarette. That was Boomerang by Oscar Cook. I'm James Denos. Thank you for listening.